1988. Formula One's governing body had just signed turbocharged engines' death warrant. Boost pressure slashed from 4.0 bar to 2.5 bar, a 37.5% cut. Fuel capacity dropped from 195 liters to just 150, nearly a quarter less. And next year, turbos would be banned completely. Most teams looked at these restrictions and abandoned ship. Williams switched to naturally aspirated engines. Ferrari focused on their V12. Even Honda's own engineers had started developing a 3.5-liter V10 for the inevitable. But 6 Honda engineers led by Osamu Goto said, "Not yet." What they created wasn't just an engine that survived impossible restrictions. The RA168E became the most dominant Formula One power unit in history. 15 wins in 16 races, a 93.75% win rate that stood for 35 years. 97% of all race laps led. This is how Honda turned a regulatory death sentence into engineering perfection. The turbo era's final act. To understand what Honda achieved, you need to know what they were up against. By 1986, turbocharged Formula One engines had become absolute monsters. In qualifying trim, teams ran boost pressures exceeding 7 bar. Power outputs touched 1,400 horsepower. BMW's dyno couldn't even measure their engine's peak. It maxed out at 1,000 horsepower, and the M12 kept climbing. The FIA panicked. Speeds had become dangerous. Costs were astronomical. Smaller teams couldn't compete. So they introduced progressive restrictions. 1987 brought the first limits, capping boost at 4.0 bar and fuel at 195 liters. Honda dominated that year with Williams, winning the Constructors' Championship with the RA167E. But 1988 was different. The regulations cut deeper. Boost down to 2.5 bar absolute. Fuel down to 150 liters. It was a double restriction, less power and less fuel to use that power. The message was clear. Turbos were finished. Honda faced a choice. Their 3.5-liter V10 naturally aspirated engine was already under development. They could switch early, like everyone else, or they could pursue turbo technology as far as possible, as founder Soichiro Honda's philosophy demanded. They chose the impossible path, the physics problem. Here's what made the 1988 regulations so brutal. When you cut boost pressure from 4.0 bar to 2.5 bar, you're not just reducing power. You're fundamentally changing how the engine has to work. Less boost means less air forced into the cylinders. Less air means less oxygen. Less oxygen means less fuel can be burned efficiently. The RA168E at 2.5 bar would produce 504 kilowatts, 685 horsepower. Testing at 4.0 bar on the dyno showed what they'd lost. 742 kilowatts, a 238 kilowatt drop, 32% of their power, gone. But that was only half the problem. Now they had to make that reduced power last an entire race on just 150 liters of fuel. No refueling, no exceptions. Run out, and you're done. The math was unforgiving. At typical turbo engine efficiency, around 300 grams per kilowatt hour, 150 liters wouldn't get you through a Grand Prix. You'd run dry with laps remaining, watching competitors cruise past your stranded car. Most teams saw this equation and switched to naturally aspirated engines. Sure, the Ford Cosworth DFR only made 585 horsepower, but it had no fuel limit. Teams could run richer fuel mixtures and push harder without the strict 150-liter cap the turbos faced. Honda's engineers stared at that same equation and thought, what if we rewrite it? The long-stroke heresy and the Tollywean gambit. Racing engines traditionally use short strokes and large bores. High revs, high power, motorsport glory. The RA168E went the opposite direction. 79.0 millimeter bore, 50.8 millimeter stroke. A bore-to-stroke ratio of 1.55. That's backwards. Deliberately, brilliantly backwards. A longer stroke means the piston travels further each revolution. More travel means better expansion ratio. You extract more work from each combustion event. It's basic thermodynamics, but it comes with a price. Long-stroke engines typically can't rev as high. the piston speeds get too extreme. Honda accepted that trade-off. They didn't need 14,000 RPM. They needed something far more valuable: thermal efficiency. Now here's where it gets interesting. They paired that long stroke with a 9.4-to-1 compression ratio. That's insane for a turbocharged engine. Most turbos of the era ran 7.0 to 8.5 to 1. Go higher and you risk detonation, uncontrolled combustion that sounds like a machine gun and destroys engines in seconds. But compression ratio is everything for efficiency. And the rule is simple. The higher you compress the mixture, the more energy you pull out of every combustion cycle. Moving from an 8-to-1 ratio to 9.4-to-1 doesn't sound dramatic, but it gives you roughly 10% more efficiency. 10% that would stretch that 150 liters further. The challenge was surviving it. High compression plus boost pressure equals detonation. Always. It's physics, unless you change the fuel. France and Honda's fuel chemists had a problem. They needed a fuel that could tolerate 9.4-to-1 compression, handle 2.5 bar of boost, allow advanced ignition timing, and stay within the FIA's maximum octane rating of 102 RON. Their solution was extreme: 84% toluene. Let me put that in perspective. Test fuels Honda evaluated used 30% toluene. Some went to 60%. 84% was unheard of. Toluene, pure aromatic hydrocarbon, benzene ring with a methyl group, has incredible anti-knock properties, but it's also volatile, temperature sensitive, and behaves nothing like normal gasoline. The final specification: 84% toluene, 16% N-heptane. RON, 101.8, just sneaking under the 102 limit. MON, 90.0, density at 15 degrees Celsius. 0.840 grams per milliliter. Net calorific value, 9,817 kilojoules per kilogram. This fuel allowed Honda to run ignition timing at 35 degrees before top dead center. That's extremely advanced. You're igniting the mixture well before the piston reaches the top of its stroke, maximizing the pressure rise during the power stroke. But toluene has a narrow boiling range, 100 to 116 degrees Celsius. Too cold, and it doesn't vaporize properly. Too hot, and you risk vapor lock. Spray cold toluene into a cylinder, and you're wasting fuel, losing power, burning money you don't have. So Honda built a heat exchanger. Engineering detail: the fuel preheater. The Honda PGM F1 injection system was sophisticated. Sequential fuel injection, one injector per cylinder, computer-controlled down to the millisecond. But feeding it room-temperature toluene would be like trying to atomize syrup. Honda's solution used the engine's own coolant. A heat exchanger maintained fuel temperature at exactly 15 degrees Celsius below water temperature. In race mode, that meant 70 degrees Celsius fuel entering the injectors, hot enough to vaporize instantly. Not so hot it would boil in the lines. A solenoid valve controlled the heat transfer. The PGM F1 system monitored boost pressure, intake air temperature, equivalence ratio, everything. It adjusted fuel temperature on the fly, matching it to operating conditions. The result? Minimum brake-specific fuel consumption of 272 grams per kilowatt-hour. That's world-class efficiency. For comparison, modern road car engines struggle to break 250 grams per kilowatt-hour under ideal conditions. This fuel heating system wasn't optional. According to Honda's SAE technical paper, it was necessary to promote vaporization and improve BSFC performance. Without it, that 150-liter fuel limit would have been insurmountable. With it, the RA168E never ran out of fuel, not once. 16 races, 15 wins, 0 fuel exhaustion retirements, ceramic lightning. Turbo lag was still the enemy. Even with all this efficiency wizardry, if the turbocharger took seconds to spool up, the RA168E would be slow out of corners. In Formula One, corner exit is everything. Honda specified IHIRX 6D turbochargers. Dual setup, one per cylinder bank. But the breakthrough was in the details: ceramic turbine wheels and ball bearings. Steel turbine wheels are heavy. Rotational inertia fights acceleration. The turbine has to overcome its own mass every time the driver breathes on the throttle. Ceramic wheels, silicon nitride to be specific, weigh 40 to 50% less. Lighter means faster response. The physics is rotational inertia. I equals 1/2 mr squared. Cut mass in half, cut inertia in half. The turbo spools up instantly, but ceramics are brittle. Thermal shock can shatter them. Honda accepted the fragility because the performance gain was too valuable. Throttle response improved dramatically. Drivability, critical in F1, went from liability to advantage. The ball bearing setup replaced traditional journal bearings, less friction, faster spool-up, better durability. At 2.5 bar boost, the RA168E's turbos delivered instant response. Test that same engine at 4.0 bar on the dyno, and it made 742 kilowatts, 1,010 horsepower. The turbos could handle it. The regulations wouldn't allow it. The 1988 season, surgical dominance. McLaren-Honda's partnership began in early 1988. Ron Dennis had secured Honda away from Williams. The MP4/4 chassis, designed by Steve Nichols, was revolutionary. Low-slung, compact, optimized around the RA168E's 146-kilogram weight. But there was barely any testing. 1 week at Imola before the season opener in Brazil. Integration problems popped up immediately. Matching engine to chassis, calibrating fuel maps, sorting reliability. Brazil round 1, Ayrton Senna qualified on pole, but suffered a gear stick failure on the grid. He switched to the spare car after the formation lap started. Illegal. Disqualified. Alain Prost won from third on the grid. Then, San Marino happened. Imola, May 1st, 1988. Second race of the season. Qualifying showed what the RA168E could do when everything clicked. Senna, 127.148. Prost, 127.919. Nelson Piquet in the Lotus 100T, using the identical RA168E engine, 130.500, 3.35 seconds slower than Senna. Same engine, same fuel, same regulations. The speed trap told a curious story. The Lotus clocked 302 kilometers per hour. The McLaren, 300.5 kilometers per hour. Piquet actually had more straight-line speed, yet he was over 3 seconds per lap, slower. The race was surgical. By lap 55 of 60, both McLarens had lapped the entire field, including Piquet. The only cars on the lead lap were the two red and white McLarens circulating in formation. Piquet had been claiming the Lotus had better aerodynamics than the McLaren. The timesheets proved him spectacularly wrong. Same engine, different chassis, completely different results. The RA168E needed the MP4/4 to shine. The McLarens finished 1-2. They would do that 9 more times in 1988. Monaco, round 3. Senna qualified 1.4 seconds faster than Prost. Prost was 1.2 seconds faster than Gerhard Berger's Ferrari. The gaps were absurd. The race was a procession. Senna pulled away from the field like they were standing still. By lap 66, he led by 50 seconds. 50. At Monaco, where overtaking is nearly impossible, and the leader usually wins by 3 or 4 seconds. Then, at Poitiers, Senna's concentration broke. A moment's lapse. The McLaren touched the barrier. Race over. Prost inherited the win. Senna went home without contacting the team. He returned to the pits later that night as McLaren packed up, apologized, and left. Disappointment was crushing. But that 50-second lead? That showed what the RA168E could do when unleashed. It wasn't just fast. It was untouchable. September 11th, 1988. Italy, round 12. McLaren-Honda had won every race since Monaco. They'd clinched the Constructors' Championship at Belgium. Senna was cruising toward his first driver's title. Monza seemed like another procession. Senna led. Prost ran second. 3 laps to go. Jean-Louis Schlesser was making his only Formula One start, replacing Nigel Mansell, who had chickenpox. Senna came up to lap him at the first chicane. Contact. Both cars out. Prost's engine had already failed, the only in-race engine failure of the entire season. Gerhard Berger's Ferrari inherited the lead and won. 1 month after Enzo Ferrari's death, Ferrari won at Monza. It was the only race the RA168E didn't win in 1988. 15 wins, 1 loss. Both McLarens knocked out by separate incidents. The streak had to break eventually. But it took a collision and an engine failure on the same day to do it. Performance analysis, the numbers. Let's quantify what Honda achieved. At 2.5 bar boost, the RA168E produced 504 kilowatts, 685 horsepower, at 12,500 RPM. Specific output, 336 kilowatts per liter, from a 1.5-liter V6. Fuel consumption, 272 grams per kilowatt-hour minimum, achieved at 11,000 revolutions per minute and 456 kilowatts. That efficiency was critical. Over a race distance, roughly 305 kilometers, the RA168E had to manage every drop of those 150 liters. Top speeds, 330 kilometers per hour at Mexico's high-altitude Hermanos Rodriguez circuit, 333 kilometers per hour at Hockenheim's Long Straight, the fastest speed all season. Reliability, 1 mechanical engine failure in 16 races. Prost at Monza. That's it. The competition? Ford Cosworth DFR naturally aspirated engines made 585 horsepower. Benetton's version, 590. Ferrari's V12 might have touched 660 in qualifying. But they all had unlimited fuel. The RA168E had 100 more horsepower and had to make it last on 150 liters. It won anyway. Race management, the 150-liter equation. Theory is one thing. Executing it over 16 races was something else entirely. San Marino's telemetry revealed the reality of fuel management. Over the full race distance at Imola, the RA168E ran at full throttle 63.6% of the time. Closed throttle, 19.8%. The remaining 16.6%? Partial throttle. The critical zone where drivers balanced speed against fuel conservation. That 63.6% full throttle number wasn't arbitrary. Push it higher, demand more power more often, and you'd run dry with laps remaining. Back off too much, and Prost behind you would take the win. The PGMF1 system calculated thousands of adjustments per second, but the strategy came from McLaren's engineers translating Honda's fuel maps into race pace. Mexico demonstrated the RA168E's hidden advantage. At 2,240 meters elevation, naturally aspirated engines gasped for oxygen. Thin air meant less power, slower speeds, desperate struggles. But turbocharged engines forced air in regardless of altitude. Both McLarens dominated the straights, while NA engines struggled to breathe. The turbo didn't care about thin air. Then, Portugal exposed the system's fragility. Estoril, round 13. Senna's fuel readout failed. The gauge showed numbers, but they weren't accurate. Without reliable data on remaining fuel, he couldn't push. He had to assume the worst, back off early, run conservative fuel maps. He finished 6th, his worst result of the season. 2 weeks later at Spain, it happened again. Same problem, same forced conservation. 4th place. Not mechanical failures, not strategy errors, information failures. The RA168E's efficiency meant nothing if you didn't know how much fuel remained. Those 2 races proved something crucial. Dominance required everything working perfectly. The engine's brilliance, the fuel's chemistry, the heat exchanger's precision, all of it collapsed if the fuel gauge lied. Different tracks demanded different strategies. Fast circuits with long straights consumed fuel aggressively. Tight, twisty layouts like Hungary used less. But the RA168E adapted to all of them, finishing race after race with the calculated margin intact. The dual water pump system played its part too. Equal cooling across both cylinder banks meant consistent power from all 6 cylinders throughout the race. No hot spots triggering detonation as fuel depleted and engines heated up late in races. No thermal-related power loss when it mattered most. 15 races finished successfully on that 150-liter limit. 15 times, Honda's calculations proved correct. Perfect fuel management required perfect engineering. The RA168E delivered both. Historical significance, the perfect finale. The RA168E statistics are almost unbelievable. 15 wins in 16 races, 93.75% win rate, 15 pole positions, 10 1-2 finishes. Of 1,031 race laps in the 1988 season, McLaren Honda led 1,003. That's 97.3%. Senna won 8 races and the championship. Prost won 7 races and scored more total points, 105 to Senna's 94, but lost under the best 11 results rule. Both drivers won with the same engine. The RA168E proved that severe restrictions couldn't stop superior engineering. While competitors abandoned turbos, Honda optimized them to perfection. Long stroke efficiency, exotic fuel chemistry, ceramic turbos, heat management, every detail mattered. 1989 brought the turbo ban. Honda's RA109E V6 naturally aspirated engine took over. It won both championships that year too. But it was different, more conventional, less defiant. The RA168E was special because it shouldn't have worked. The regulations were designed to kill it. Instead, Honda created the most dominant engine Formula One had ever seen. That record stood until 2023, when Red Bull's RB19 won 21 of 22 races. But even they only managed 95.45%. The RA168E's 93.75% came under restrictions that made dominance impossible. The Honda RA168E, an engine built to fail that refused to lose, strangled by regulations yet faster than anything unrestricted, given 150 liters when it needed 195, and made every drop count. 6 Honda engineers took physics that said no and chemistry that said impossible and produced 15 wins in 16 races. They ran 9.4 to 1 compression on boost pressure with rocket fuel in a heat exchanger. They spun ceramic turbines on ball bearings and stretched 150 liters across 305 kilometers without running dry. The turbo era's last hurrah became its finest achievement. Not the most powerful engine, not the most brutal, but the most brilliant. When the FIA banned turbos in 1989, Honda had proven their point. Sometimes the best engineering happens when you're told something can't be done, and then you do it anyway.